if you say we are going to defend the sovereignty of Poland and then you don't, that looks really bad globally. You know, Britain's prestige would plummet, would lead to all sorts of problems. You are saying that you're giving carte blanche to dictators to just run amok and take whatever territory they want. You are risking a future upheaval of the global order, away from democracies into the hands of dictators. You know, in the West, people believe in democracy and believe in the advancement of freedoms of people. This is, you know, to echo the words of Roosevelt in August 1941. You know, they're aspiring to a world free of want and fear. Now, obviously, there's still some issues with the form that democracy takes in the 1930s. It's not democratic for everyone. You know, try saying that if you're in Nigeria or India or whatever, or if you're you know, in the black southern states of the United States. But the aspirations are there, and I think that's an important distinction. And I think by saying that Churchill is the chief warmonger of the Second World War, I think is ludicrous. You know, it's the same thing about the bombing. You know, the detractors of strategic air campaign always go, yeah, but you know, Germans had the Holocaust, but weren't the Allies just as bad, just killing all those civilians? It's like, no, because the moment Hitler stopped the war, the bombing would stop. You know, the moment the war stopped in Hitler's favor, the killing would continue and be accelerated.
So the thing you mentioned initially is this sort of the idealist perspective of, well, Britain can't allow sort of this warmonger to break all these pacts and be undemocratic, you know, murder a large number of people and do conquest of territory. Okay, that's idealistic, but if we look at the realist perspective, what decisions would minimize the amount of suffering on the continent in the next 50 years? So one of the arguments that he's making, I happen to disagree with it, to put it mildly, is that Churchill increased the amount of suffering. So Churchill's presence and decisions. So we're not talking about idealistic perspective. We're talking about a realist, like the reality of the war, of Stalin, of Hitler, of Churchill, of France and FDR. Did Churchill drag Hitler into a world war? Did he force Hitler to invade the Soviet Union? Did he force Hitler to then invade, attack Britain?
Well, no, because Hitler was always going to invade the Soviet Union unless the Soviet Union invaded Germany first. So that was always going to happen. No one asked Hitler to invade the Low Countries and Norway and Denmark and attack Britain. He does that, of course, because he's not given a free hand in Poland. But there's no question that Hitler would have also wanted to subdue France, or certainly turn France from a democracy into a totalitarian state as well. I'm absolutely certain about that.
So I think there's pretty definitive evidence. I mean, it's obvious from everything he said, from everything he's written, from everything everywhere, that he was going to invade the Soviet Union, no matter what.
Yep.
And France, most likely, yes, also.
He would have done a deal with Britain. Britain could have coexisted.
So actually, there is a possible reality, I don't know, maybe you can correct me on this, where Hitler basically takes all of Europe except Britain.
Yes, but then he would have got so strong that he would have then turned on Britain as well, you know, because he would, you know, the fear is that if you let him do this, and then he gets greedy, he wants the next one, then he wants the next one, then he wants the next one, and, you know, then he wants to take over the whole world. You know, that is the fear of the British. That is the fear of the Americans. That's the fear of President Roosevelt, who's got a very, we haven't even touched on this yet, but he has a very difficult case on his hands because he's come into power also in January 1933 as president of the United States on an isolationist ticket, with a retrenching, with a kind of sort of, step away from the European old order. It's time for the Europeans to start on their own. It all sounds very familiar right now. And suddenly he's got to do this gargantuan political volte-face and prepare the nation for war, because he also fears, like Churchill fears, like Chamberlain feared as well, that Hitler's designs are not purely on Eastern Europe and the Lebensraum there, but would get ever bigger. And I don't doubt that they're right. I think if he'd prevailed in the Soviet Union, he'd always wanted more, because his whole concept is the master race,
Yeah, I think it should be said, if we measure human suffering, if there was not Britain on the other side, if it was not a two-front war, that the chances of Hitler succeeding in the Soviet Union is much higher, or at least a more prolonged war, and there would be more dead, and more enslaved, and more tortured, and all of this.
Yes, and ditto if if the Allies hadn't got involved against Imperial Japan, it would have been catastrophic. I mean, 20 to 30 million Chinese dead anyway, with American and British intervention. What's it going to be in China without that? I mean, and elsewhere, because the reason why Japan invades French Indochina, now Vietnam, and Hong Kong, and Malaya and Singapore and so on, and Burma, is because it's not winning in China and it needs more resources because it's resource poor, and America has cut off the tap. So it's going into these countries to get what it needs. It's rubber and oil and natural resources and ores, precious ores, and all the rest of it. And if it had been unchecked, it would have done so. And then it would have absolutely built up its strength and overrun the whole of China with even more deaths. So, I think one of the interesting things about the Second World War is lots of wars and why people get involved in them are extremely questionable. But I think there is a moral crusade to the Allies and what they're doing that I think is entirely justified. What I think is interesting also is that as the war progresses, if the Allies are supposed to be on the force of the good, how come they're doing so much bad? And at what point is doing bad stopping you from doing good? And at what point are you doing good but also doing bad at the same time? Such as destruction of cities, destruction of monasteries on outcrops in southern Italy, destruction of killing of lots of civilians, etc., etc. These are difficult questions to answer sometimes. They're also incredibly interesting, and I think that moral component starts to blur a little bit by kind of middle of the war, by 1943. It's kind of easy to have a fairly cut and dry war in North Africa, in the deserts of North Africa, where the only people getting in the way are a few sort of Bedouin tribesmen or something. But once you start getting into Europe or getting into the kind of the meat of highly populated countries in the Far East, for example, that's a different kettle of fish, because the scale of destruction is absolutely immense. But it is also the job of political leaders to look after and defend their own peoples first and foremost. And so what you're doing is you're trying to protect your own sovereignty, your own people, before you're protecting other people. And so that's what leads to, the whole way in which the Western Allies are protracting war is to try and minimize the number of deaths of their own young men as much as they possibly can, whilst at the same time winning the war. And that means bringing lots of destruction to your enemies, but also trying to minimize it. And the way you bring lots of destruction to your enemies is by using immense firepower and this concept of steel, not our flesh, which I mentioned earlier on, and technology, so that you don't have to bring to bear too many of your young men's lives. You don't have a repeat of the slaughter of the First World War. So, it is really interesting that in our mind's eye, when we're thinking of the Western Allies and the Second World War, probably the first thing that comes into mind is Americans jumping out of landing craft on Omaha Beach on D-Day, for example. Those are infantrymen. They're the front line. They are the coalface they're the first people going into the fire of the enemy. And we tend to think about guys in tanks, infantrymen with their Garand rifles or machine guns or whatever. That's what springs to mind. Yet actually, they're a comparatively small proportion of the army. So no more than 14 to 15% of any army, Allied army, is infantry. 45% are service corps, service troops, driving trucks and cooks and bottle washers and people lugging great big boxes of stuff. And that's because by that stage, the Allies have worked out the way of war, which is to use what I call big war. This concept of a very long tail, logistics, the operational art, making sure that people have the absolute best you possibly can, great medical care, huge advances in first aid and medical care of troops, getting them back onto the battlefield. And you're using firepower and technology and mechanization to do a lot of your hard yards. So, that's the principle behind strategic bombing. If you go over and bomb and you can destroy infrastructure and civilians and households, that makes it much harder for Krupp to make those Panther tanks and Tiger tanks or whatever it might be, and guns. And you're disrupting the transportation system in Germany. You're making life difficult for them to do what they need to do. Then that means it's going to be easier for those 15% of infantrymen who've got to jump out of landing craft to do their job. And you're trying to keep that to a minimum. And you'd have to say, broadly speaking, that's a very sensible policy that makes an awful lot of sense. The consequence of that is a huge amount of destruction. And maybe that's what Darryl Cooper's driving at. But no one asked Hitler to invade Poland. I mean, that is the bottom line. No one asked Germany to go to war. No one asked Hitler to come up with these ludicrous ideology.
Yeah, there's complex ethical discussions here about just like as you described,
which are fascinating.
And war is hell, and there's many ways in which it is hell. Just for a little bit to steel man what Darryl is, where he might be coming from, is since World War II, the simplistic veneration of Churchill, sort of saying Churchill good, Hitler bad, has been used as a template to project onto other conflicts to justify military intervention. And so his and other people like libertarians, for example, resistance to that overly simplistic veneration of somebody like Churchill has to do with the fact that seems to be by neocons and warmongers in the military-industrial complex in the United States and elsewhere, using Hitler way too much, using Churchill way too much to justify invading everywhere and anywhere.
I do agree with that. I think oversimplification of anything is a mistake. Life is nuanced. The past is nuanced. It's okay to be proud about certain things, and it's okay to be disgusted by other things. That's absolutely fine. We have a complicated relationship with our past. It doesn't need to be black and white. And life is not a straight line. And of course, the Allies make plenty of mistakes in World War II. Overall, I think they made the right calls. And I think one of the things that's really interesting is I think that the Allies, for the most part, use their resources much more judiciously and sensibly than the Axis powers do. And, good, because that means they prevail. I think, there are so many lessons from World War II that could have been brought into the history of the last 30 years, which weren't, such as, if you decapitate an incredibly strong leader, you get a power vacuum. And if you don't have a solution for that power vacuum, lots of bad elements are going to sweep into that in very quick order, which of course is exactly what happens in Iraq. So, Donald Rumsfeld going, we don't do reconstruction. Well, you freaking well should do. If you're gonna take on this particular challenge, you've got to see it through. That's simply not good enough. It's not good enough to go into Afghanistan and go, okay, we're going to change things around. It's going to be great. All the women are going to have education. They won't have to wear kind of, they won't have to cover up their bodies anymore. Anything goes. We love liberalism. It's great. Let's make Kabul into a thriving city once more. And then suddenly bug out. Because what's going to happen? You're going to undo everything. And I remember being in, this is a bit of a segue, Lex, but I remember being in Northern Helmand province back in, when was it? January 2008. And British troops had just taken over an absolute dump of a town called Musakala. And I remember talking to this Afghan guy. He'd just had all his willow trees chopped down to make room for a helipad that the Allies wanted, which said, they put their kind of those cages with kind of rubble in, the protective wall. Is it called HESCO? I think it was called. Anyway, I said to him, what do you think about the British being there? And he just shrugged at me, lifted up his hands and said, well, if they stay, great, but they won't. And he said, if they stay, then brilliant. But he said, I'll tell you what, he said, Taliban weren't great. They weren't fantastic. He said, but I could leave my purse on a wall and no one would touch it. I could leave it on a wall for a week, no one would touch it. He said, will they bring that kind of order? Will we have peace here? They've just chopped down my willow trees. Thanks a lot. And you're seeing a total lack of understanding of the culture, the ethnic differences. You're trying to impose a kind of Western-centric view onto something which is just onto a nation which isn't ready for that. Now, there are ways in which, it looked like Afghanistan was starting to kind of emerge and there was a path. And then just at the critical moment, the West moves out with catastrophic consequences. What you have to say, though, is that in the West, post-1945, the rehabilitation of Italy, of Japan, of Western Germany was really good. The consequence of all that destruction, all that turmoil, was thriving, high-producing democracies which burst forth into the kind of second half of the 20th century and into the 21st century in pretty good order. So the lessons of the previous generation for the First World War had been learned, even though the scale of destruction, the displacement of people is unprecedented in 1945.
In 1939, what was the state of the militaries? What were the most powerful militaries on the world stage at that time?
Well, in terms of naval power, it's Britain, as we've already discussed, and the United States. France has a pretty large navy. Japan has a pretty large navy. Italy has a pretty large navy, but Italy's navy is by far and away its most modern aspect of its three services, air, land, and sea. But it doesn't have any aircraft carriers and it doesn't have any radar. So, it's they've got modern battleships and battle cruisers, but without key modern bits of technology.
So Italy is really not ready for war.
Oh, it's so not. It's so not. It's just, again, both Hitler and Mussolini, they lack geopolitical understanding. That's because they're so kind of focused on their narrow worldview. And they view everything through that prism, but they can't see that bigger picture.
And we should say that Mussolini, maybe you can correct me, But I don't think at any point he wants war.
He doesn't want a war. What he does want is he wants his own new kind of Roman Empire, which extends over the Mediterranean, the kind of certainly the eastern part of the half of the Mediterranean, North Africa, all the way down to kind of East Africa, controlling the Suez Canal. That's what he wants.
And I think he made clear that he was. I mean, there's always like this little brother jealous of Hitler kind of situation because he wanted absolute power the way Hitler did,
but doesn't have it.
Doesn't have it. And
It's king.
Yeah, there's a
monarchy. Often forgotten. It's amazing.
So there's always this limit, and Hitler quite brilliantly, once he gets some power, he takes it all.
Yeah.
Complete.
He completely emasculates Mussolini. And he likes him, though. It's really weird. Even when Mussolini's about to fall in July 1943, he has a meeting at Feltre, just literally a few days before Mussolini tumbles. And he does that because he likes Mussolini. He likes him as a man and thinks he's been his friend. And, you know, he respects him to a certain extent, even though he definitely views himself as top dog. Hitler does, that is. So it's kind of curious because I don't think Hitler particularly likes anyone, really. But he does seem to like Mussolini. But anyway, the problem with Mussolini is Mussolini's Italy is very impoverished from the First World War. You know, and that, of course, leads to the rise of fascism and the overthrow of parliamentary democracy, and why Mussolini takes place in the first place. You know, again, it's that kind of, there's been this terrible disruption, there's been financial crisis. That leads to kind of people looking at an alternative. You know, what's the alternative? Well, Mussolini's going, you know, we can be proud Italians again, lots of chest thumping, you know, wearing great uniforms, all the rest of it. And people kind of think, well, you know, I'll have a piece of that. And it kind of works. And, you know, proverbially the trains work on time under him and so on and so forth. But he just gets ahead of himself, you know, and actually the writings on the war in 1935 when he goes into Abyssinia and you know, against sort of what effectively are kind of, by first world European standards, primitive tribesmen in Abyssinia, you know, they have quite a tough fight there. You know, they do prevail, but it's not a complete walkover, and they get a bit of a bloody nose at times, and they shouldn't have done. And they're just not ready. They don't have the industry. You know, they're tied up into the Mediterranean. They don't have access to the world's oceans. They do have some merchant shipping, but not a huge amount. You know, they just don't have what is required. They're dependent on Britain for coal. Britain is the leading coal exporter in the world in the 1930s. So Britain's approach to fascist Spain and approach to fascist Italy has been very much sort of stick and carrot. It's like, you know, we'll let you do what you do as long as you kind of stay in your box. And you know, we'll continue to provide you with supplies and coal and whatever it is you need, as long as you don't kind of go too far. And so that's why Mussolini is very anxious in 1938 and again in 1939 to kind of be the power broker and kind of not let Germany go to war. But Germany's just, you know, they signed the Axis Pact of Steel in May 1939, where they become formal allies. This is Hitler and Mussolini, Italy and Germany. But it's always a very, very unequal partnership right from the word go. And one of the reasons Mussolini signs it is because he fears that Germany has designs on Italy.
Yeah.
It's not because he thinks, oh, these guys are great. You know, they're our natural bedfellows. It's so that he can. It's a mutually convenient pact whereby Germany gets on with whatever it wants to do up in Northern Europe and Eastern Europe. Italy is given a free hand to do whatever it wants to do. They'll just kind of watch each other's backs. They have borders, you know, Austria and Italy border one another, and they'll just do their own thing, and they'll kind of help each other out with supplies and stuff. But basically, they won't. They'll be their own. It's a kind of marriage of convenience. You know, they're never expecting to be fighting alongside each other on the battlefield. Not really. There is a kind of obligation to do so, but it's an obligation with no expectation of ever actually happening. And so from Mussolini's point of view, the Pact of Steel is kind of, it's just sailing your flag to one particular mast and kind of trying to cover your back. And so long as he plays his cards right, he can still get his coal supplies from Britain. He doesn't have to worry about that. The Pact of Steel doesn't make any difference to that. The problem for him is that in June 1940, he thinks that France is about to be defeated and that Britain will surely follow. And so he thinks, I've got some rich pickings. I can take Malta, I can take British possessions, I can overrun Egypt, and now is my time. But I also need to kind of join the fight before France is completely out of the fight. Otherwise it looks like I'm a Johnny come lately, and I won't get those spoils, because the Germans will go, yeah, you can't have all this stuff, you've turned up too late, you need to be in the fight. So he does it what he thinks is the perfect timing, and it turns out to be a catastrophic timing, because of course Britain doesn't exit the fight. Britain is still there. And, by February 1941, a very, very tiny British army in Egypt has overrun, 2 entire Italian armies and taken 133,000 prisoners in North Africa.
So you mentioned in the sea, who were the dominant armies. Who was dominant in the air?
Well, in the air, it has to be the Luftwaffe, and it is also the Imperial Japanese. Both in the Imperial Japanese Navy and the Imperial Japanese Army, they both have air forces. And one of the reasons that is because the quality of the pilots in Japan is extremely high, because it's so difficult to get to the top position. You are going to your frontline squadrons with at least 500 hours in your logbook. To put that in some perspective, a British RAF or Luftwaffe pilot would be joining their frontline squadrons with 150 to 170 hours in the logbook. So it is that these guys are disciplined to within an inch of their lives. They are, there are academic tests as well as physical endurance tests. They are the elite of the elite, and they are extremely good. The problem they have is that there is a good number of them, but there's not that many. The Luftwaffe is the largest air force in the world in 1939, but it is already at a parity in aircraft production with Britain. And the French have a kind of similar sized army, but they're very, very badly organized. So they're organized into different regions, and one region is not really talking to another. And one of the problems that when Case Yellow, the German invasion of the West, starts, France's army of the air is spread throughout France and has its own little area. So you have one bunch of fighters and bombers in that block in the Marseille area. You have another block in kind of on the Brittany coast, and you have another block in around Sedan, and you have another that. So consequently, they're never able to kind of bring their full strength to bear. So it's although they've both got about 3,500 aircraft on paper, and about 2,500 that are fit to fly on any one given day, the Luftwaffe, because they're the aggressor, can choose how they mass their aircraft and where they attack and at when. So, in other words, the Luftwaffe can send over overwhelming amounts of bombers and fighter planes and pulverize a French airfield and catch them napping. And because the French don't have a defense system, they can't see whether they're coming. So their only hope is to kind of take off and just hope they stooge around the sky and hope they bump into some Luftwaffe. And of course, that's inherently inefficient, and they get destroyed. And they get destroyed in penny packets rather than en masse. Difference with the RAF is the RAF is not done on an Air Force basis, where you have each air corps or air fleet has a handful of bombers, a handful of fighters, a handful of reconnaissance planes. They have different commands. So they have bomber command, fighter command, training command, coastal command, and they all have very specific roles. So they're structured in a completely different way. And that's because they're an island nation. And because they see their role militarily in a different way, and because the rearming that Britain has done in the 1930s is all about defense. It is not about aggression at this point. Not about taking it to the enemy. It is showing you're tough, but also first and foremost getting your ducks in a row and making sure that you don't get defeated. So this is the principle behind the first the world's first fully coordinated air defense system, which is the radar chain, it is the observer core, it is control rooms, it is interesting technology such as identification friend or foe, IFF, which is where you have a little pulse, so you have these control rooms and you have a map table and you have a tote board in front of you where you can see what squadrons are airborne, what state of readiness they're at, whether they're engaging the enemy. Little lights come on and show you can see weather maps, you can see the cloud ceiling, you see all of that at a glance. Then you're on a dais, and then down in front of you is a massive, great map of southern England. You've got croupiers kind of moving plots, so you can, through a combination of radar, which picks up a kind of a rough idea of what's coming towards you, combined with the observer core, you have overlapping observer core stations all over Britain, covering every single inch of airspace over Britain, looking up into the air and seeing how many aircraft there are and at what height they are. And you have little thing called a pantograph, which is a piece of equipment which helps you judge altitude. You then ring through that. That all comes into the control room along with the information from the radar stations, which is going into a single filter room at Fighter Command headquarters, which is then being pushed straight back out to the sector stations. So this information is being updated all the time. So you have a plot and it looks like it might be, enemy bombers 30 plus, for example. That's constantly being adapted. So as more information comes in, you will change that. And then you can see that actually it's only 20 aircraft or 22 aircraft or whatever. So you're updating that, and that little figure is put on your little plot and moved across. And so you can see, and then because you can identify your own aircraft, you can then see where they are moving. And you're also on the guys in the air are on the radio to ground controllers who are in these control rooms, and they're saying, okay, well, if you proceed at, Angels 18,000 feet, on a vector of, 150 degrees, you should be seeing your enemy bombing formation any moment now. And what that means is that you're not on the ground when the enemy are coming towards you with their bombers to hit your airfield, which means you're in the air, so that all they're doing is hitting a grass airfield, which you've already got bulldozers and diggers and graders and lots of scalpings and earth ready to fill in the potholes. And it means you're good to go. And it means, as a consequence of all that, when the Germans do launched their all-out assault on Adler Tag, Eagle Day, on the 13th of August 1940, the British are ready. They can see them coming, they know what to expect, and they can anticipate. And it means that they're not being caught with their trousers down on the ground. And as a consequence of that, of the 138 airfields there are in RAF airfields there are in Britain, only one of them is knocked out for more than 48 hours in the entire summer of 1940. And that's Manston on the tip of the Kent coast, which is abandoned for the duration.
So these are the two biggest air forces.
So those are the two biggest air forces.
So Luftwaffe, we should say German. I mean, they're like the legendary, the terrifying air force.
They are.
Maybe
they're slightly believing their own hype. There's no question about it.
Well, the rest of the world is also, right?
They've just had it too easy. So they don't have ground controllers. They don't have an air defense system in Germany, because why would you need an air defense system? We're going to be the aggressor. There's no scenario where we'll have to defend the airspace of the Third Reich because we're on the offensive. So they just haven't prepared it.
So there's that clash, the Battle of Britain, the clash of air forces. What explains the success of Britain in defending?
Well, and everyone always says, the few were the last line of defense against the Nazi hordes and all this kind of stuff. And it's all rubbish. They're the first line of defense. Second line of defense is the Royal Navy, which is the world's largest. And there's absolutely no chance on earth that a German invasion force made up of Rhine River barges, out of every three is motorized and the other two aren't, is ever going to get successfully across the English Channel. And even if they did, they would be repulsed. I mean, it's just no chance. And it is often forgotten that while the Luftwaffe is coming over and bombing Britain every single day, so is the RAF going over and bombing Germany. And one of the problems that the Germans have is that